You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the Unsolved Colonial Parkway murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas.
Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
And we are back this week with episode 2 of Thomas Hargrove from the Murder Accountability Project. We really enjoyed our last discussion with Thomas, and we are so thrilled that so many of you seem to enjoy it as well. So we are happy to bring you part 2, which we think is actually even more interesting and mind-blowing than the first part.
If that's even possible.
If that's even possible.
We were so lucky to get Thomas as a guest, and we think the issues that he talks about with us are so incredibly important. We hope you give it a careful listen and hope you enjoy it as much as we did.
And then we hope you do check out the Murder Accountability Project, because they do have a website that you can go to look at, and it is quite interesting to go digging through that data, if digging through data is your thing, and it happens to be both of ours.
That's true. Very important reminder, our long-awaited television series on the Colonial Parkway murders is making its debut on the Oxygen Network this Thursday and Friday night. Mm-hmm. The Lovers Lane murders. It's two-hour specials, so set your DVRs now.
Yep. This
Thursday and Friday night. There's also one other thing I wanted to mention, and please heed this warning carefully. The show contains reenactments of the 4 double homicides in the Colonial Parkway murders, which can be disturbing, and the show uses graphic crime scene photos. So if this is something that you are not comfortable viewing, please heed this warning. I know that there are a number of people, particularly family and friends, who will struggle, and this is one of those things, when you see a photograph like this, you can't unsee it.
Yeah.
We think the show is very well done. It's very compelling. I think people will enjoy the show and get a lot out of it. And there are a lot of important issues raised by the investigators in their discussions with family members, with the two of us, and any number of other fascinating people that we were lucky enough to get to participate in the show. But you got to go into it with the full knowledge that there are some moments that are very difficult to watch.
We have both struggled at times watching this, and we are so incredibly grateful that we had such skilled and excellent investigators who were willing to spend time on this case. There are moments when it may be difficult to watch, so please, as Bill said, heed that warning. As always, the English teacher is here to provide you with your homework. If you have not already done so, and so many of you have, please go ahead and leave us a 5-star rating or review, or preferably both, on the podcast platform of your choice. We cannot thank you enough for the excellent reviews that we get, because it does help us grow our podcast audience, and it makes us feel good about the work that we are doing. So when you leave us a great review, we do see it, we read it, we bask in your praise, and we do thank you very, very much for giving us that positive feedback. That does help us a lot.
Well, thank you all very much. And then finally, this should surprise no one at all. When we started this podcast a year ago, we were also working on the Lovers Lane murders television series for Oxygen. We've held off now for more than a year in getting into too much of a deep dive on the Colonial Parkway murders. However, Kristin and I now feel that we are unbound, and because we wanted to respect the fact that the television series was coming out. Now that the television series is running this next weekend, we intend to start a pretty serious analysis and discussion of the Colonial Parkway murders over the coming weeks. And it's our goal to have as many family members, investigators, journalists, forensics experts, and probably 3 or 4 other categories of great people that I'm forgetting, to participate in a discussion about the Colonial Parkway murders, the issues that are raised by the television series, where we think the investigation needs to go, how close we might be on various aspects of the Colonial Parkway murders, keeping in mind when you watch the show, some people feel that these could be independent events or they're not all related in a linear 1, 2, 3, 4 fashion. These are the kind of issues that we want to explore in the coming weeks here on Mind Over Murder.
If you have not already done so, we do encourage you to like and follow our social pages, both here at Mind Over Murder and at the Colonial Parkway Murders page. We do run both of those. We do moderate both of those, and we are very interested in answering your questions there. Please do feel free to follow both those pages and ask us questions as you see fit. It is very possible that we will be doing a podcast episode over a question that you bring up, so listen closely. Thank you so much for listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll see you next time. And we are joined again by Thomas Hargrove of the Murder Accountability Project. Thomas, thank you for joining us again.
Happy to do so.
This has been such a fascinating conversation so far, and we actually wanted to apologize because you're providing such amazing information, and some of it's a bit disturbing, and we both kind of jumped in a few times, like with what and how and that kind of thing. So we wanted to ask for your forgiveness for us jumping on you.
I'm a good Episcopalian. I have to forgive. So you are forgiven.
And you've been very zen about our friends in the federal government. The thing is, we're fans of law enforcement. We're pulling for law enforcement success. We want to see the issues that the Murder Accountability Project is exploring. We want to see those addressed. We're so thrilled that you're doing this work. What I wanted to steer back to is last week you were telling us a bit about the lawsuit against the federal government. What's the official name of the lawsuit? Is this Murder Accountability Project versus the United States of America?
It's the Murder Accountability Project versus the United States Department of Justice et al. There are actually 10 federal agencies that we're suing. The Department of Justice, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Interior Department, the National Park Police, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Department of Defense, the Department of the Army, the Department of the Navy, and the Air Force.
What is
I think I've got them all.
Now, this was probably filed pre-COVID, back when we actually met face-to-face over conference tables. What does it feel like for a group of you to decide we're going to sue the United States of America?
We didn't do this lightly. In fact, we sent letters to federal officials advising them that they're in violation of the law, that Congress passed the Federal Uniform Crime Reporting Act of 1988, which requires all federal law enforcement to report major crimes that they investigate to the Uniform Crime Report, effective on January 1st, 1989. Nobody did. So we advised Christopher Wray, the director of the FBI, and his counterparts at other law enforcement agencies that you are in violation of the law. And that's okay if you give us the data. So please assist us in assembling the missing information of 31 years worth of major crimes. Christopher Wray passed our complaint on to the director of the Criminal Justice Information Services Division, who wrote back agreeing that they are in violation and they're hoping to become in compliance with that reporting law perhaps in 2 years, not addressing our request that all of the data that should have been reported should be reported. And so we tried to have negotiations saying, look, if necessary, we'll go to court to compel, but we really want to avoid that. Would you be willing to meet? There was no meeting allowed. And so our next act was reluctantly to go to litigation. And so under the Freedom of Information Act and under the Uniform Federal Crime Reporting Act, we filed a lawsuit seeking every agency that we can think of that would handle homicide investigations, that they must report data to us.
Did any of the agencies respond in a more meaningful way than the FBI did? Did anybody say, yeah, you're right, and we're working on it? You're talking about something where it's not just a failure, it's a failure for 30 years.
Yeah, I have to give credit to the Department of Defense. They were aware 20 years ago that they were in non-compliance with the reporting law. And for 20 years, they've been kicking it around. They actually created a military reporting system. It is not exactly analogous to the FBI reporting system, but it's close. They acknowledged that they were in non-compliance. There actually were a couple of Inspector General reports that said we're in non-compliance of this reporting requirement, and this is not an option. We have to do this. It's the law. But those IG reports were now more than 10 years ago. They were aware of the problem and were slowly taking steps. And to date, the Defense Department is the first federal agency to actually pony up data as a result of our lawsuit. And we're getting thousands of records, not just of murder, but of other major crimes. Thousands of records in response to our lawsuit. Unfortunately, it does not meet the reporting standards. The Defense Department wants to withhold identifying information about the defendants. So the Uniform Crime Report and especially the Supplemental Homicide Report require that the age, race, sex, ethnicity of victims be reported, and the DoD was fine with that. But also age, race, sex, ethnicity of offenders who have been arrested. That is also required to be reported, and the Department of Defense wants to withhold that information.
This seems kind of bizarre, though. They're willing to cough up basically general statistical information about the victims, but not about the accused
offenders.
Perpetrators. I'm not saying the offenders are necessarily guilty. They might not have all been found guilty. What's the logic there?
Their argument is that these people are mostly service members who have the right not to have the fact of their arrest be disclosed to the public, that there's a privacy issue. We disagree with them that if you are arrested for murder and you happen to be in the Army, you enjoy no better privilege than any other murder offender enjoys in terms of privacy. It's a very public thing. You get arrested for murder, the public has a right to know that.
Exactly.
To know your name, to know your, everything. That routinely is reported in civilian law enforcement. It is, as of right now, the Department of Defense takes the position that they can withhold that information in our lawsuit. We have pushed back, of course, that there's no way to know whether a case is solved or not if we don't have the demographic information of the offenders. So we're pushing back. I'm pretty sure that the court will hold that the Department of Defense must meet the same standard everyone else must meet for the data that they report.
And I think you could make an argument that the members of the armed forces, and I come from a Navy family, they have a right to know as well. In other words, there are perpetrators in their midst. And we're talking about serious crime here. We're not talking about pilfering a candy bar from the commissary here. We're talking about rape. We're talking about murder. We're talking about very serious crimes here. And who are those victims? In most examples, they are probably also service personnel. Mm-hmm. And they have a right to know that there are threats and that there are problems. Look, I don't think much of this is going to be a surprise. If you take a look at the basic statistics of military perpetrators, they're going to be overwhelmingly male. They're going to be probably mostly young. They're going to probably have a fairly healthy percentage of minority participants because that's who makes up America's military these days. Again, I come from a military family, but I just find it such a head scratcher that they would fight you over something as simple as general information about perpetrators, which, as you said, would be available on the civilian side of law enforcement.
Yeah, and we don't think they'll be successful. That it's pretty clear that the law requires that the same elements that are reported by civilian law enforcement must be reported by federal law enforcement. In the end, I think the law will prevail and that we'll get all elements that are required. But it may take a while. Right now, we don't even know if the Department of Defense is gathering into a central file the demographic information of the people they charge with major crimes. We'll see. But they are required to report it. And so we are confident that in the end, we will get the data that the law requires.
Forgive me for asking, but if Judge Amy Berman Jackson found in favor of the Murder Accountability Project, and I hope that she does, if some of these agencies wanted to appeal that decision, what level is above Judge Jackson?
The appellate court and then the Supreme Court. I don't know if this will go that far, frankly. FOIA cases, Freedom of Information Act cases rarely go that far, but sometimes they do. I'm amazed that this case has generated the pushback that it has, especially given that initially the federal government's position was, well, we acknowledge that we're in violation and we'll just negotiate now for the production of data. They went from that position, which was, we thought, the correct position to take, to we're going to fight you any way we can. We're arguing that you didn't cross all the T's and dot all the I's for exhausting administrative appeal. In fact, to that argument, we did something interesting. Our lawyers said, well, we got lots of time on this case. It's going on for months. So when the government took the position that we hadn't exhausted administrative appeal remedy, we went ahead and filed a second lawsuit and filed it to the FBI, and they again refused. And so we then appealed to the Justice Department's Office of Appeals, and the law requires that they get back to us within 30 days. What they did was they told us, well, you're now on a waiting list. And so we then filed a new lawsuit saying that the 30 days has passed, and we got no better result than we had with the first lawsuit. Mm-hmm. But the second lawsuit, we argue, renders the failure to exhaust argument moot. That when we do jump through the hoops of appealing a denial, we got no better answer than we got the first time. So we'll see. We'll see what Judge Jackson does with this case. It's not a simple case. It really is not. And she has to go through hundreds and hundreds of pages of arguments and depositions from experts. But I think in the end, the law will prevail.
What do you think accounts for that intense pushback that you're getting? Is it embarrassment on the part of, the government for not being in compliance with the law? Or I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist here, but is there something they're hiding? What is going on? Why that amount of pushback?
Yeah, I can only speculate as to that. We wondered why this law, this reporting law passed in 1988, was completely ignored. And I wondered if it could have anything to do with national security concerns, whether there were spy-on-spy engagements that resulted in the homicides that the FBI did not want to report for security issues. But no, my friends in the FBI say, no, that ain't it. They probably genuinely did not know that there are a significant body of cases that they should have been reporting and weren't. That is a more reasonable position. As to the pushback, though, in order for us to obtain the data necessary, this would require an incursion into very carefully maintained and very sensitive government databases. The FBI does not want its Sentinel case management system to become a public record, even carefully maintained output from it, because they regard Sentinel to be very, very seriously classified, and it should be, frankly. What the FBI does has to be protected as a matter of course for the very sensitive things they do. We are sensitive to that, but at the same time, many good things come from creating a complete record of homicide. When you carefully count things, magic ensues. We've documented that it is possible to identify serial murder through purely statistical means, just looking at the data. Since the federal government is not reporting homicides to itself and making it available to the public, we're not able to test the theory that is rampant in Indian country, that there is something going on, that there are too many murders and too many abductions of Indian girls and women. They believe that there are serial activity of some sort occurring on the reservations. We don't know if that's true. The limited data we're seeing from civilian law enforcement does not support that theory. But we don't know what the data will look like when we get it from the FBI. I have talked to investigators looking into the narrative of there being too many murders and too many abductions of Indigenous women and girls who have expressed frustration that the record is so incomplete that it's very difficult for them to do their jobs. There are federal investigators that I've spoken with, and there are state investigators, and they've all expressed frustration that the data are so haphazard. Indian murders should be reported like every other murder. We'll see. Once we get the data, and we will, I'm pretty sure, once we get the data, one of the first things we'll do is to check to see if there have been alarming patterns of unsolved homicides on Indian reservations.
And that type of statistical analysis that you've done in other localities has highlighted cases of serial murder. Am I correct? In other words, you've pointed out in other places around the country to your law enforcement partners, you need to be looking for potential serial killers in such and such a place, much in the same way that with the power of that information in Indian country, you might be able to highlight what's happening with Native American and Indigenous girls and women.
Yes, as I often say, there is a magic to counting things carefully. And when you create a complete record or pretty complete record of homicide, often you can see patterns emerge. And serial murder is very prone to killers who kill to a pattern. And when they do, then often that activity can be spotted statistically. In fact, years ago, when I was an investigative reporter for the Scripps Howard News Service in Washington, I was doing a story looking at the optional crime, which is prostitution. Whether or not a city chooses to arrest women or Johns for soliciting prostitutes. And to do that story, I needed the Uniform Crime Report, and I got that from the database library at the University of Missouri. And the librarian there, at no extra charge, threw in something I'd never seen before, the Supplemental Homicide Report. I'd never heard of it, and I opened it up. You know, they paid me to be curious, and so I opened it up, and I saw line after line of individual murders. The age, race, sex, ethnicity of each victim, how the victim was killed, the circumstance of the killing. In other words, that's the police theory as to why the crime was committed. And if an arrest was made, the age, race, sex, ethnicity of the offender. Now, I don't know where these thoughts come from, but the first thing that occurred to me when I saw this was, would it be possible to teach a computer to identify previously undetected serial murders? And for years, I begged my editors to try this, to try to develop a mathematical procedure to identify serial murder. I was aware, I used to have a job as a police reporter in Birmingham, Alabama. And that's a great way to start out in life, as a cop shop reporter. And while I was there, the Atlanta child murders next door occurred. And the Atlanta Police Department was widely criticized for not recognizing the pattern sooner. That failure is fairly well known among criminologists. It's called linkage blindness.
Right.
It's very difficult to recognize that there's a series going on, because when a murder occurs, a homicide detective is assigned to the case. When another murder occurs, usually a different homicide detective is assigned.
Right.
If there are commonalities to the case, those commonalities are only recognized if those two detectives have a discussion over the water cooler.
Mm-hmm.
If those murders occurred in different jurisdictions, that conversation never happens.
Exactly.
So I was aware of linkage blindness as a problem, and I wondered if we could teach a computer to spot serial murder. So I begged and whined my editors literally for years, for 6 years. And finally, my stock was high enough that Peter Copeland, my bureau chief and a wonderful man, told me in 2010, okay, you've got a year. Try it. And who gets that? Wow. A year to do this? He said, you also have to produce a package that will work whether you're successful or not. And so we studied unsolved murder in every community in the United States. And so we
Right.
started building the database that is now the backbone of what we do at the Murder Accountability Project. And we worked for months to try to develop an algorithm. We were finally successful. We used as our teacher Gary Ridgway, the so-called Green River Killer
Yes.
up in Seattle. He was convicted of killing 48 girls and women, and in many cases depositing their bodies out of doors in the Green River Valley, which is how he got his name. At the time, he was America's worst known serial killer. And so we set out trying to develop a program so that the computer could tell us something god-awful happened in Seattle in the 1980s.
Right.
And we found 100 things that don't work. But we finally, through a kind of cluster analysis, found a system that does work. We take the hundreds of thousands of murders in America and we turn them into tens of thousands of groups. We cluster them by the sex of the victim, the method of killing. At first, we tried age groups, but we later dropped that out. It didn't really matter.
Right.
And the location of the murder, the county in which the murder occurred. We cluster to that, and then we have the computer calculate a new variable. What percentage of those cases were cleared by arrest?
Mm-hmm.
And then we analyze those groups that we created. And we look for groups that have a very low clearance rate. And when we did that, Ridgway's murders popped out clear as a bell that most of his victims were in our group. And the computer found that just through a purely statistical method.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after these messages.
Do you like our show, Mind Over Murder, and want to create your own podcast?
Well then, let us tell you about Anchor.
First of all, it's free. And who doesn't love free, right?
I like free. There's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer.
You can even add any song from Spotify directly to your episodes. The possibilities are endless for what you can create, whether it's music analysis, your own radio show, or something the world's never heard before.
Anchor will then distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and many more platforms.
And you can even make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership.
I like the sound of that. It's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. Right here, Anchor.
Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started on your own podcast.
You can tell them Kristin and Bill from Mind Over Murder sent you. One of the most frequent questions we're asked here at Mind Over Murder is, how can I help?
Thanks to Othram, a leading forensic DNA testing lab for law enforcement, you can get involved and help solve real cases.
If you have tested at a consumer genetics company, you can contribute your data to DNAsolves.com. The process is easy and confidential. Just 2 simple steps. Your DNA might be the missing piece that helps solve the identity of an unknown person.
Then Mind Over Murder will highlight cases Othram is working on to seek your crowdfunding support for DNA testing to help solve these cold cases.
Upload your DNA profile to DNAsolves.com. It's easy, free, and confidential.
Then join Mind Over Murder as we help families find answers with Othram and DNAsolves.com.
Welcome back to Mind Over Murder.
The computer also found hundreds of other clusters of highly suspicious looking murders. In some cases, they were known serial murders. In other cases, not known. And so we started trying to figure out what was what. We started calling. We took 10 clusters and we contacted police. In the case of Youngstown, Ohio, I left a phone message on the chief of detectives saying, this is Tom Hargrove. I'm calling from, I'm a reporter from Washington, D.C., and we've developed a computer model that we think is identifying serial murders, and we're showing too many unsolved murders of African-American women in your jurisdiction in the 1990s. Did you have a serial killer? And a half hour later, my phone rings, and the chief of detectives was saying, well, that's the damnedest phone call I ever got.
Wow.
So I went down and interviewed my older detectives, and they told me something I did not know. He was kind of a young man. They told me something I did not know. Yes, we thought we had a serial killer. We definitely thought we had one, and we never got him. On the basis of that call, he said, I'm going to start again, and we're going to see if we can now run the new DNA technology, if we still have that evidence. And so we tried to get the rape kits because the killer was raping women and then shooting them. And unfortunately, those kits had been destroyed.
Why did I know this was coming?
Yeah. But he tried, and he tried contacting other jurisdictions where they had similar murders, and to no avail. But he really tried. But nobody knew about this cluster of killings that were suspected to be serial. Nobody knew this.
Was there any avenue left for the good detective team in Youngstown to pursue, or the lack of the preservation of the rape kits was the proverbial brick wall?
Yeah, nothing new to date. I mean, DNA requires samples to test.
Right, to test against, right.
Yeah. Unfortunately, there is a huge backlog still in America of untested rape kits.
Oh, yeah.
And
We've talked about it quite a bit on Mind Over Murder, and I think these two things tie in together without question.
Yeah, but the detective chief in Youngstown, Ohio, was a good guy, and he was really trying. He eventually made chief of police for 5 years. That's about as long as a chief lasts. That's a terrible job. You don't want to be a police chief.
No.
If you're really good, you'll last 5 years. You know, it's a hard job. But they tried. Another cluster that the computer was highlighting were 15 strangulations in Gary, Indiana, and not one of them had been solved. And so I called to the Gary Police Department and talked to the public information officer and explained what we had. And he called back a few hours later and said, I went and talked to our homicide detectives, and they assure me there are no unsolved serial murders in Gary, Indiana.
I'm shaking my head, though. You had the statistics.
Yeah, well, how could you possibly know that? Yeah, how could you possibly know that there are no unsolved serial murders?
Well, you're not trying to make them look like schmucks. You're trying to help them highlight what could be a pattern in their community. Actually, let me take that back. You're trying to highlight what was a pattern in their community.
Yeah. We sent letters to the mayor and the police chief in Gary explaining. We sent the names of all of the victims that we had identified and the narratives for the cases, and it really sounded like a classic serial killer. Women found, there were two patterns. The larger pattern were women who were found, young sex worker age women who were found in abandoned buildings and empty alleyways, abandoned properties, of which there are quite a few in Gary.
Right.
And there was a smaller pattern in which older women were found murdered in their homes. And in one or two cases, the home was set on fire. We thought there were two different patterns there. The larger pattern was pretty evocative of a series. And nothing happened. The mayor, the police chief would not answer our letters. We sent registered mail.
Wow.
At the same time, we sent similar communications to the Lake County medical examiners, and they took an entirely different tact. They assigned an assistant coroner to work the case. They agreed with us that there were too many unsolved murders, that there were too many of these cases for it to be a coincidence. And they actually added 3 more strangulations that we didn't know about.
Right.
Wow.
So they tried, but they also were not able to get a serious sit-down conversation with Gary, Indiana detectives. But at least we had local authorities agreeing that there was something amiss, and it was the algorithm that did that. So we went ahead and published our story. You can download a copy of it at our website. And we said that authorities in Youngstown, Ohio, and Gary, Indiana, opened new investigations as a result of an algorithm that we've developed. And that was the end of it, or so I thought. Then in 2014, the Hammond Police Department, right next door to Gary, Indiana, was summoned to a Motel 6, where they found the body of a 19-year-old woman named Africa Hardy, who's dead in the bathtub, strangled. They were able to make an arrest right away. They arrested Darren Dion Van, and they had a spectacular interview with him. They got him to confess to killing Africa Hardy, and they asked a question that should always be asked once you get a confession: have you killed anyone else?
Mm-hmm.
And Mr. Van said, well, come to think of it, yeah, I've been at this for quite a long time, going back to the mid-1990s.
Mm-hmm.
And he agreed to take police to some of his more recent work. And so the Hammond Police Department contacted Gary and told them we're coming in. And they got Van to find 6 other bodies of women he had recently killed and hid in abandoned properties. A total of 7 women who were killed recently in 2014 or 13. And the next day, when the news hit that America's newest serial killer had been found in Gary, Indiana, the police chief was asked by a reporter, did you know that there was a serial killer active in Gary?
Oh, no.
And the first thing he said was absolutely not. And
wow.
I went ballistic. It was a very frustrating experience. We had sent dozens of communications to everyone we could think of in Gary, Indiana.
And he couldn't even deny that he got the letters. You sent the letters certified mail.
Well, there have been many police chiefs in Gary. Remember, police chiefs don't last
it's a
very
tough
long.
gig. Understood.
And Gary had 5 police chiefs in rapid succession, so he wasn't the same guy that we originally had sent letters to. But
nonetheless, the department knew.
Well, the department should have known. Certainly, I was doing everything I could to make them aware of victims that certainly were the work of Darren Dion Van. Till the day I die, I will be racked with wondering, could I have done something else to get Gary to actively consider the possibility of a serial murder? Could something have been done to keep those 7 women from dying?
Well, that's a real difficult burden for you to place upon yourself and your colleagues at the Murder Accountability Project. No. Here you are half a country away trying to compel law enforcement to take a look at something that they have missed. And I can imagine it's got to be a tough sale when you reach out to one of these communities and say, this is something that you should be taking a look at. And the example of the chief of detectives in Youngstown, Ohio, responding in such a immediate and responsive way, in other words, a half hour later, there's your phone ringing saying, well, that was a strange phone call, but the guy was on it, versus the endless pushback that you got from Gary, Indiana, until the good detectives in Hammond realized we have a problem and we're right next door to Gary. Yeah. And I don't know, but guilt, again, I'm a good Episcopalian, so I have a double dose of guilt. I guess I can be glad I'm not Jewish, because then I would really feel guilty. But I'm a nice Catholic boy from Boston, and we do guilt pretty well too. So
yes, you do. Yeah, and I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I'll never know. Catching serial killers is really not easy. In the case of what had been America's worst serial killer, Gary Ridgway, it took more than 20 years for a task force, and the task force did everything right. They really did, and they never caught him until DNA finally caught him. But for 20 years, they tried, and it was an enormous outlay of manpower. They recognized the series right away, and they put a multi-agency group together, including federal and state officials, as well as local police. I swear they did nothing wrong. Ridgway was on their list. He was a suspect, but Mr. Ridgway passed a lie detector test, and so they took him off the list. Yeah, serial killers are tough. I guess I try to tell myself it wouldn't have mattered if I'd been more persuasive in 2010 with Gary police, but,
And we interviewed Kristin Pelisek, who wrote a book on the Grim Sleeper case in Los Angeles. And I was living in Los Angeles at that time. And she's based in L.A. And she did a terrific book, and it was a very interesting interview. She made the same point in that example, the Grim Sleeper who had passed away a year or so ago, Kristin? I think it's...
more like 2 at this point.
Okay. There's that Bill Thomas time thing. I always
Bill
think
Thomas
it's
time, yeah.
less time than it's been. So it's probably 2 years ago now. He focused on women that were on the fringes of society. He focused on sex workers, and he focused on women that were wrapped up in the crack epidemic, which was sweeping South Central Los Angeles and the whole country at that time. The truth is, finding serial killers has to be incredibly difficult. We've interviewed people who've tracked down serial killers, and as you said, Tom, it takes years of great detective work for criminals to be identified. I'm hoping that with the advent of advanced forensic testing and forensic genealogy, we can skip back in time on some of these cases and help resolve them. But it's really difficult. And you've got people who are incredibly evil and yet have a highly developed sense of what's required to get away with murder.
Well, and unfortunately, serial murder is more common than we want to believe. We've engaged a project with the scholar who put together the Radford University serial killer database. And together we've merged the Radford data to our data. And I can tell you that most serial victims are female, and that officially the FBI has published a statistic that serial murder is rare, which is true, and that it accounts for less than 1% of all homicides, which is not true. Because we were able to link specific cases using the Radford serial killer database, we were able to go victim by victim. And I can tell you that overall, 1.6% of all female homicides are known serial murders. Among cases that were originally reported to the FBI as being unsolved, but were later solved, that percentage actually goes up to about more than 3%. Nearly 4% of all unsolved murders eventually are discovered to be serial murders. By definition, a serial killer is someone who's good at it because he had to get away with at least his first murder. You're a serial killer if you kill 2 or more people in separate incidents. And so by definition, they are more successful than most killers in getting away with their murders. And so among cases that are reported to the FBI as being unsolved, a much higher than has ever been previously acknowledged rate are known serial murders.
Wow. So it's more like 3 to 4% of unsolved murders are committed. That
are known.
Right. So the number
only the devil
higher.
knows what the truth is.
Yeah. Right.
Wow.
So our algorithm, thanks to this project with Radford University's data, our project has improved on the algorithm. Instead of forming groups, we instead have the computer individually assess each murder, comparing to other murders that happened immediately before and immediately after, looking for an unusual clustering of unsolved murder. This is a much better system. And this new algorithm is generally identifying about 7 or 8% of all female murders as being possible serial killings. What is the truth? Only the devil knows. But I can tell you that the rate of serial murder among women in the United States is more than 1%.
It's at least 3 to 4, and it could be up to 7 to 8%, is what you're saying.
Something like,
Right. Could your algorithm provide investigators with these clusters? In other words, could you, I'm not trying to be flip here, could you provide a top 10 list of localities where you believe there are clusters of serial homicides that deserve investigative resources?
Yes, kind of, yes. In fact, we already post that online. You can go to our website and go to the Murder Clusters tab.
And this is at your website?
Right. And you're looking at the older algorithm right now. We haven't finished programming the newer one, which we will sometime this year. We're almost done. But the old algorithm was proven effective. And so you'll see in recent murders, you'll see a large circle of unsolved murders in Cleveland, Ohio. You'll see another very large cluster of unsolved murders in Chicago.
Right.
So we went working with local journalists in both places. We put together lists identifying the names of the victims, because you don't get names with the FBI database. You get the month of the murder, the year of the murder, the age, race, sex, ethnicity of the victim, the method of killing, but that's all. And so we tried to put, from published sources, names and narratives with the murders.
Right. So the
and
basic.
We did that with Cleveland, and it looked highly suspicious to us. It looked like there were an unnatural number of unsolved murders along two major roads in Cleveland. The Cleveland Police Department put together a task force to make an attempt to review. As a result of that review, they did solve a murder that had not been cleared before. That was good. But they've yet to prove a serial killer. But they are continuing to look at those cases. They have a large number of unsolved murders of women. In the case of Chicago, the Chicago police eventually agreed to put together a task force with the FBI, and the algorithm identified 51 murders of women who were strangled, and they were overwhelmingly, 50 of the 51, their bodies were found out of doors. Their bodies were found, again, this is going to sound a little familiar, in alleyways, empty buildings,
right,
abandoned properties. Very similar to the Darren Dion Van series.
Right.
In fact, we're not sure if Mr. Van may be responsible for some of those.
They do fit his pattern.
Yeah. But we think there is more than one serial killer active in Chicago, 2 or 3. We think one of them is white and the others are African American. 3/4 of the victims are African American. 1/4 are white or Hispanic. They were overwhelmingly disrespected. Their bodies were found in trash cans. In several cases, the trash cans were set on fire. Their bodies were disrobed, or they were found nude or nearly nude. A very sexual component to many of these. When you put names and narratives to these 51 murders, it screams serial killer, and we're quite confident that these 51 women were not murdered by 51 separate men.
No.
That this is a clear pattern. Off the record, police in Chicago and the FBI agree with us. On the record, we have no proof of serial murder, and that's simply a truthful statement. What is odd about these cases, we're talking about a hands-on strangulation or asphyxiation of 51 women who were often sex workers.
Right.
And this is a physical form of murder where the killer had to be in close contact with the victim, and in many cases may have had sex with the victim. Well, despite the large body of victims, the police recovered only 21 foreign DNA samples from 18 of the victims. It's a mystery to us. It's a mystery to the police why so little DNA was recovered in these cases.
Is that sloppy police work, or is that, could he be, wearing a condom? What's going on there?
We don't know. The chief of detectives, we've had conversations about this, and he asked hard questions of his people. And he tells us that, the rate at which DNA is being retrieved from murder scenes has improved in recent years.
This is true.
That we're getting better at it as the technology has gotten better. So is it incompetence? I don't know. I don't think so. But it is odd that so little DNA has been retrieved. Now, it should be noted, and golly, I hate to speak ill of serial killers, but a lot of these guys...
Oh, go right ahead.
Okay. As long
Some
as
of them listen to our show.
They're dysfunctional. And a lot of these guys are sexually dysfunctional. That's why they do what they do, to get their jollies by killing women. And so it is not uncommon for a serial killer not to have sex with his victim.
Yeah.
So it may be that. We don't, or it's just a guy who watches all the CSI crime shows and has really gotten good at not leaving his DNA behind.
Some of our forensics experts have said that to us on this show, that including people that produce some of these shows, they've said, look, unintentionally, we have educated a generation or more of perpetrators how to avoid getting caught.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you watch procedurals especially, and I'm not saying I haven't enjoyed an hour watching a show like that every now and again, but they do actually educate you about how perpetrators are caught. And if you watch carefully and think, I'm not going to make that mistake, you may be able to get away with murder.
Yeah. Yeah, we don't know the answer, but it is highly worrisome that so little DNA has been recovered, because DNA has been the golden bullet, silver bullet in a great many cases. That's how they finally solved the Golden State Killer. So we don't know why. There are many possibilities, but I can assure you that those 51 women were not killed by 51 separate killers.
Without question. Happen. So our listeners can go to your website, murderdata.org, to learn more about these cases and about these issues. Believe it or not, we're actually at the end of a second episode.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So with your kind permission, Kristin and I would very much like to have you back in the future to talk more about the work that you're doing at the Murder Accountability Project.
We'd like an update on the lawsuit, all sorts of great stuff. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the chance to talk.
And we appreciate the work that you're doing. This is phenomenal. And we can't wait to talk to you again all about the work you guys are doing at the Murder Accountability Project. And one more time, your website is?
Murderdata.org. You can call up clearance data for your hometown, or you can explore individual murder cases. You can be your own armchair detective and look for serial killers.
And if someone wanted to support the good work that you're doing financially, are there ways to make a contribution to your not-for-profit organization?
Just click a button. We don't have salaried people. Nobody gets paid. I don't get paid, but we do have expenses. And so, yes, we're very grateful when people support us. And so there's a donate button, and we're very grateful.
We'll recommend it, and we'll include it in our show notes for these 2 episodes. We can't thank you enough.
Well, thank you, guys. This has been very nice. These 2 hours have gone by really fast.
Thank you so much for listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll see you next time. Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawlspace Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.